Welcome to Chautauqua People. I'm John V. My guest today is Dede Trefts. She is from a 7-generation Chautauqua family. Sharp Field was named after her great-grandfather. Dede is a native of Western New York, having spent her first 11 years in East Aurora, then moving to Shaker Heights, Ohio. She spent her childhood summers at Chautauqua, residing with grandparents and great-grandparents, and took flute lessons. Her family has many multi-generational friendships with other Chautauquans. She ushered in plays and opera and worked to earn college money. Dede did an internship in Washington, D.C., graduated from Wellesley College, and subsequently earned an MBA from Harvard. She has been employed by several companies, including a 28-year run at IBM. Dede served 2 terms on the Chautauqua Institution Board of Trustees, during which time she developed an understanding of the environmental practices at Lake George, New York. Dede, how did you get to know what was going on there?
John, I was reading through the internet, intranet at IBM as an employee in sometime in 2013 and noticed a fascinating article on some research that was just starting up at Lake George. And I got a little nerve up and decided to go ahead and call the chief researcher, who was the scientist in the research division at IBM, who was running the program. It was a fascinating conversation. He was available, open, happy to share what was going on, and the whole, expose was really interesting. So we ended up having a little bit of a conversation with a few folks at Chautauqua and around the lake. And it just seemed to me that this was something we really were going to want to pursue longer term.
Now, are these lakes in New York State ranked by environmental quality?
Yes, the New York State DEC has ranked 12 lakes as what they call harmful algal bloom, or HABs. You'll hear me use that expression, lakes. Lake George is actually the most pristine. It is at the top of the list, and Lake Chautauqua, unfortunately, is the one that is ranked very last.
Uncrushed.
Dead last. Yes.
And,
yes.
And so what did they do in Lake George?
Well, very interesting. I organized a group of us to go in October of 2018 to Lake George to actually find out for ourselves. So we had some folks from the institution. Michael Hill came with John Shedd and some of the folks from our team. George Barella, who was then county executive, and his organization came. Courtney Wigdall-Perry from SUNY Fredonia went, Pierre Chagnon. So we brought a whole group of folks from the county to come and listen to what the story was and where they were going with this project at Lake George. We had an amazing 2 days. We started out with a visit to the Darren Freshwater Institute, which is Rensselaer Polytech's one of the 3 partners. I should step back and say there are 3 partners in the Jefferson Project, one of which is IBM, the other is RPI, and the third is the Fund for Lake George, which is now known as the Lake George Association, or LGA. So all of them were present. We went to this beautiful boathouse on the shores of the South Basin of Lake George and had an incredible experience listening to what they had done to map out all of the dimensions, the currents, the temperature changes, the chemistry, the biology of the lake. And also heard a little bit about some research they had done which was specific to harmful algal blooms in Skinny Atlas Lake. It was very, very impressive because the team had inserted some equipment, some very sophisticated sensing equipment into Skinny Atlas Lake, and then pulled out some data that was absolutely critical to understanding what was going on in their lake with harmful algal blooms. Skinny Atlas is probably in the mid-range in terms of being impaired, so somewhere between where we are and the pristine quality of Lake George. But anyway, we saw these simulations and heard their theories, which they then later actually confirmed. And we're pretty amazed by the technology and the capability of these partners. We went out in the middle of the lake Got a chance to see the vertical profilers, which was an adventure in itself. It was kind of a windy, rough day, and the equipment was out there gathering a lot of data. I think they gather millions of data points during a week's time about the quality of the lake water, what's going on weather-wise, temperature conditions, and so forth. And then we went down to Bolton Landing, which was the kind of meeting place, central location with the Lake George Association, who had invited multiple participants who had been involved in some of their actual programs. So the Jefferson Project will facilitate a very, very sophisticated data collection, but then that data is provided in a very collaborative way to all the interested parties in a particular area. So in this case, the municipal water authorities came to the meeting. The mayor was there, the county executive, some representatives from the tourism board. It was just fascinating because the whole group met with us to talk about what had happened subsequent to all of the data that they'd actually been able to gather from the lake. One of the things that they had discovered in this data collection process was that the salinity levels in Lake George had increased markedly over the course of the last several years. And which seems very odd for a freshwater body.
Mm-hmm.
So they told us, with multiple participants kind of jumping in to kind of share their perspectives on what had happened, the story about identifying that as an issue, and then how people collaborated around the county and within the municipality of Bolton Landing to address the issue. What they ended up doing was working together to design, well, turns out the source of this was road salt. So the topography around Lake George is extremely hilly. There are very steep inclines. There's a lot of runoff that goes right into the lake. They don't have the kind of agricultural pollution and runoff that we do here at Lake Chautauqua, but they have a lot of salt that flows into the lake. So they worked together collaboratively to actually design a brand new snowplow with sensors on it, such that when the sensors detected ice, salt would be deposited on that spot, but only then. It turns out that that initiative, within a couple years' time, dramatically reduced the salt content, the salinity of Lake George. And it was a huge win for everybody at the table, who said that not only did they actually have a chance to share data and understand what was going on at Lake George and take action, but their road salt bill for the municipality went down by something like 80%.
My goodness.
It was incredible. And the tourist industry, of course, was thrilled because the water, was even better than it normally was. And, motorists were safe. I mean, there wasn't any change in terms of accidents or vehicular problems during the winter months. So they've really demonstrated, in this one case and many others, that the data that can be provided really can be the source of a catalyst for change in the community and really create some very dramatic results, that have been high impact on the lake.
So indeed, this project, Jefferson, does it have a formal leadership component, or tell me about how they make decisions?
Sure. It is a party, kind of a partnership that involves some very senior people at IBM, at RPI, and at the Lake George Association. Shirley Jackson, who is the president of RPI, is personally involved with this. John Kelly, who was the SVP at IBM, who ran IBM research and actually is credited with developing the Watson computer, the AI capabilities, is on this full time. And there's a very talented, gifted man by the name of Eric Sy at the Lake George Association, who has a knack for bringing people together and launching initiatives that have been incredibly successful. So those parties are involved and really have been working with us. John Kelly right now is kind of spearheading much of the initiative that's happening with us at Chautauqua as we move forward together in partnership. But I kind of think these are some of the best brains and minds in this space that we are lucky enough to have working with us at Chautauqua.
Do they have a big budget?
The budget really is sourced from multiple sources. I think IBM has tended to source its support via in-kind, donations of computer time, quantum processing capabilities, scientists, researchers, modelers. RPI does the same. They tend to have leverage with a lot of their students, PhD, masters, and undergraduate students who work together. The Fund for Lake George, in that situation, had actually raised funds to work with the county, which then, contributed to the building and design of the snowplows and replacement of all of them over time and so forth. So I think funds have been kind of sourced from each of the partners in the most appropriate way. So very much on a project-by-project basis.
So it sounds like it's not been a big tax burden to the local property owners then?
No. In fact, what we have seen, at least with Lake George, is that there have been some pretty major cost reductions coming from some of these initiatives. So people who were earlier kind of at each other's throats thinking that there might be some really negative consequences have been amazed to see, that the fiscal tax, situation has really not been changed.
Now, with the reduction in road salt, that's an issue, is it not, for everybody concerned? How do they get data out of the lake?
Interesting question. We have a couple of pamphlets here that are final reports, annual reports from the Jefferson Project that have been written about their work at Lake George.
And what is this technology that's behind the boat?
So this is called a vertical profiler. It's actually a buoy that is super intelligent. It has a computer on it. It is fired by solar power. It has a weather station, and it has probes that take water temperature and other samples going within millimeters of the bottom of the lake.
Wow.
So it is very, very sophisticated equipment that needs to be monitored. It has to be cleaned. It has to be repaired occasionally. There are kind of maintenance crews that need to go out. And what this does is, you can see the antenna that you, when you were showing that, it actually sends data into the cloud. So there's a platform that is that holds data that is accessible by researchers at RPI, at IBM, and elsewhere, should they desire it, which is one of the nice things that's, I think is very appealing about this project, is that the partners are very, very interested in collaboration, data sharing, and kind of getting away from worrying about whose science is governing what project, but really making all of this data available to everyone.
Now, are there underwater currents, because you're going down that deep? I guess the big question is why?
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of wave action in these lakes. One of the really interesting, it can be caused by runoff, it can be caused by underground springs, can be caused by wind action and so forth. So the combination of the biology, the plant life, the runoff, the weather conditions, the temperature in particular, wind factors and so forth, all of these constantly varying conditions, as well as what happens within the strata of the lake at various what they call thermocline levels, oxygenation, et cetera, have a major impact in terms of what is going on with the health of the lake and whether or not there may be an algae breakout. So what was really interesting I was talking a minute ago about when we were at the Darren Freshwater Institute and we saw the simulation of Skaneateles Lake, was that the team had hypothesized that there was an internal wave. So you think about the wind stirring up waves on top of a lake. It turns out that wave action actually continues when it hits the far shore. And underneath all of this lake, there is a wave called a sesh that will stir up internal sediment.
Called a sesh?
Sesh.
Sesh.
S-E-I-C-H-E. Sesh.
Okay.
And so what becomes very important is not just what's going on relative to runoff from a watershed and temperature and so forth, but what's called internal load in a lake. And there may be 10 feet of load or hundreds of feet of load, which really has been deposited from, hundreds of years of use of the lake. Dumping, runoff, all kinds of things create that. And that may be stirred up and contribute to the overall health of the lake, and especially to algae blooms with the right conditions. So that situation at Skinny Atlas, when we were privileged to see what had happened, the hypothesis around it and what the models said, ended up being validated by the Jefferson Project some months later, because they had installed all the equipment in the lake and were able to actually test their theory and check it with data. And it did turn out that the algae blooms in that particular case were being caused by this internal wave action and a combination of wind and weather conditions. Notably, the city of Syracuse draws all of its drinking water from Skinny Atlas Lake, and it is unfiltered. So what the scientists and the researchers at the Jefferson Project have been able to do now is to give the city of Syracuse 3 or 4 days heads up as to when there will be an outbreak, based on the monitoring they can do of the wind and wave, temperature, currents, et cetera, so that the city prepares, shuts off the valves, and there are alternative sources of water provided to city dwellers. So there are, really interesting programs, I think, that vary quite a bit depending upon what is ailing a particular lake, what the situation is, and whether humans and and animal life is likely to be affected by the conditions at a certain point in time.
Now, was that lake, or the two lakes we've talked about, George and Skinny Atlas, troubled with invasive species?
I don't know so much about Skinny Atlas, but Lake George definitely. We heard and actually went to a very interesting installation that the Jefferson Project had worked to get installed on Lake George to deal with just that problem. At one point in time, back in early 2011-13 or so, there were reportedly 5 known invasives in the lake, and there was a lot of concern about the number increasing. The Jefferson Project participants went to various installations around the United States to look at what technologies existed to be able to address that problem. They settled on some capabilities to clean boats with high pressure, high temperature power washing that they had seen at Lake Tahoe. And they brought what they learned back to Lake George and installed, work with the Park Service to actually install boat launches that were fully equipped with these special cleaning stations. So we actually went to one at Boat Landing. It was really interesting to see and hear how these little microorganisms get into the lake. And I thought that what they did at Bolton Landing was absolutely brilliant, because they work with the Park Service to ensure that on parkland in the state of New York, there are not fees for New Yorkers to be able to access the lake and so forth. So the Park Service actually is responsible for manning and outfitting these launch stations so that New York State boaters are not responsible for paying heavy fees. I think at Lake Tahoe back 5 or 6 years ago or so, it cost you $200 to $250 every time you wanted to put your boat in the water, because it had to be cleaned. Yeah. So I thought it was just, act of brilliance to be able to partner and work out a solution that really would benefit New York State residents.
So then if someone comes along with a boat, Park Service from the state oversees the cleansing process?
They clean it. It's quite a thorough process. The amazing thing about this initiative as well is that, again, real world results, the number of invasives, last time I checked in with the team, had gone down to 3.
Let me get this straight. The number of invasives has gone from 5 to 3 with this cleaning project.
Yeah.
The salinity of the lake has dropped with a difference in use of salt and this gear on the front of snowplows.
Yep. And other projects, several others, were initiated by the research and the findings. People gathered around a table and talked, folks who had been very, very uncomfortable with each kind of adversarial positions for years before some of this data was shared. They installed, it turned out that the largest polluter in the lake, the largest leakage of nitrogen and phosphate was actually from the town of Bolton Landing's municipal sewage plant. So they raised a bond and cleaned that up and replaced the plant. I think it was at least 100 years old. It was built in the 20s. So that was one other area where there were significant results. And septic systems and septic runoff is also a problem, very similar to Chautauqua, where we have a lot of old and leaking systems. They worked with one of the banks in town to develop a no-interest loan program for consumers, homeowners, cottage owners who wanted to replace their septic systems, and again, results are great. So one of the nice things I think about our partnership with the Jefferson Project is that there are going to be certain solutions that have been implemented that we will be able to leverage. We have our own set of issues at Chautauqua that we're still really trying to get to the bottom of, understand the science, and get the data lined up to really get a very good picture of what's going on in our lake. But there are certain things that we can leverage right out of the hot hat.
Are there any items that need specific immediate attention in Lake Chautauqua?
I think the scientists are still really trying to get to the bottom of what is causing the significant phosphorus, and nitrogen issues that we have that really have generated the kinds of algae outbreaks. We've experienced them both in the North Basin and the South Basin. You could almost think of the Lake Chautauqua topography as two different lakes that meet at Bemis, and very interesting action happening in that area where both basins meet. There have been two profilers, so you saw the picture of the two at Lake George. We have had, this will be the third year that profilers are going in the lake. In fact, tomorrow is the day that they will be starting to be deployed in the North and South basins,
How
which
long
is
will
great.
they be there?
They typically are there until November, when the weather gets a
Okay.
little bit too tough to maintain and kind of get out in the boats and take care of them, and the lake starts to freeze. But anyway, the data is being collected, and I think what they have learned is how incredibly complex our lake is, because we have everything that Lake George has and a lot more. So that just given the fact that now they're inserting sensors in each of 6 major tributaries this year. There will be, I think, another 5 or 6 going in next year. They'll be able to spot and learn a lot more about the runoff.
So next year we would have approximately 10
Sets of
tributaries
sensors that would be
monitoring
right,
the input into Lake Chautauqua.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So we're getting a lot smarter about the lake, and I think once the data has been collected, we'll have a really interesting, some really interesting discussions about what to do and what some of the options might be.
That's great. That's great. Now, is there any low-hanging fruit things that could be done immediately?
That I think we would probably have to ask the researchers. So maybe if I could suggest that Rick Relia and Harry Kolar come on to a future program, I think it would be wonderful to
I'm going to get a name
have them.
after we're through here and put that in the book, so I could pass through them and say, hey, we need to have some ideas as to what should happen here.
I think they would love it. We have a group of researchers at the moment who have been studying Chautauqua for quite a while, and we have had, I think, 3 different lake conferences over the last couple of years that Chautauqua Institution has sponsored. So people like Courtney Wigdall-Perry from SUNY Fredonia and the Jefferson Project, and any number of other scholars and academics who've been doing research. Bowling Green, there is a young man who just got his master's from Oneonta who was looking at what they call the aerosolization of blue-green algae as it evaporates. What is the effect of that on recreation in the lake environment? There's been a lot more work on algae and what really happens to algae in the water column, in that it does not disappear. It's there. You may not see it, but it's there, and there can still be harmful effects to you and your animals. So there's just so much going on that is so interesting. I think Dr. Wigdahl has been collecting data for the last 15 years with her students, her undergraduates from Fredonia. So people may have seen them out in the lake in addition to now, the yellow profilers that are out there. But again, the researchers are all in the stages of, getting early data sets, sharing information, collaborating, trying to figure out what exactly is going on, and to be continued as we move forward and get some results.
I have one question I always like to ask, particularly for somebody who's had some in-depth experience along the way. And you've been working these lake issues for several years now.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say if some young Chautauquan comes to you and says, Ms. Trefts, I want to get involved in environmental issues.
Uh-huh.
Give me some advice. How would you reply?
I think there are some fabulous programs from an academic perspective to look into. So depending upon the age of the individual, there are some great offerings. We are actually doing a lot more in terms of programming and support with the Climate Initiative with Mark Wensler and Toby Shepard, who has just joined us as the Lake Project Manager.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of these areas where watching the lake, there's a lot of citizen science that goes on. If somebody actually has access to a boat, calling the right people, so Toby and Mark, when you see something on the lake that doesn't look right to you, is tremendously helpful, because we may have sophisticated monitoring equipment, but people picking up change on the lake on a day-to-day basis can really make a huge difference. They spent a lot of time at the last lake conference talking about, what to look for. If it's green, don't go in, don't let your dog in, call. I think I would just encourage people to pursue this area because I do think there's so much interesting work going on. And this is not just a Chautauqua problem. It's not just Skinny Atlas Lake. It's not just Lake George, New York State. This is a problem that we will be dealing with for generations if we don't get to the bottom of it now as a country, and believe me, it's global.
Indeed. And if we don't face the music, things are going to get substantially worse.
Yep.
And we don't want to lose the lake. That's a magnificent asset. We are out of time. Anything else we need to cover?
I think we've covered it. I would just encourage people to Google the Jefferson Project, and if you're on the grounds tomorrow and want to watch the profilers go in, or if you're on the lake, please be careful of them. They are very expensive assets. Don't jump on them. Don't fish on them or near them, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But let us know if you see anything that looks strange.
You bet. We hope to get the video from the Lake Conference, run it on the Access Channel in the next few weeks.
Good.
So thank you so very much, and do come back in a bit when we've got some more to share.
Good. Thanks, John.
Right on.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.